Stories of decline are very popular. They've been told for thousands of years, and many of these stories of decline have the power of myth and archetype behind them. And one of the common themes in many stories of decline is that there's a bit of arrogance to it. Typically, there's some sort of hubris or pride or arrogance that leads to the decline of whatever character or institution that the story is talking about. And in a lot of ways, historians and storytellers have applied this concept, this theme, this archetype of decline to the fall of the Roman Empire. Historian Kyle Harper argues that this arrogance that is a typical theme in stories of decline can specifically be applied to Roman attitudes towards nature. At the heart of the Roman character, at the heart of the Roman ethos, is a sort of grit and determination and steadfastness that they can overcome any obstacle. Typically, this manifests itself as sort of a military attitude. There's no secret that the Roman desire for conquest and integration of the military into society was a key factor that got us to a Roman Empire in the first place. And this idea of conquest applies to nature as well. There was this attitude that man could conquer nature. Think about the gladiator games where Romans would bring in animals, beasts from all corners of the empire. This was seen as a symbol of prestige when Romans would have their triumphs, their parades through Rome. Oftentimes these exotic animals would be part of it as a way to symbolize prestige and as a not so subtle reminder that the vast reach of the Roman Empire expands all throughout the known world. It's actually not uncommon for powerful states and powerful civilizations to have this attitude when you go back and study the history of it. Just as an example, on this podcast, I talked a lot about communist China, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and how Mao Zedong's obsession with conquering nature led to millions and millions of lives lost. And there's plenty of other examples throughout history. But one of the problems with this idea of conquering nature, this idea of man as the measure of all things, so to speak, is that nature doesn't care. And nature almost always strikes back. And we're now at this part in the story where nature is about to strike back against the Roman Empire, and it's going to test the resilience of the people in charge, the political systems, the economic systems, and the people living inside the empire. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, maybe the greatest of all Roman emperors, lived through one of these first shocks of nature striking back. It was known as the Antonine Plague, and you have to think that it and events like it influenced the way that the great Emperor Marcus Aurelius thought. In his meditations, he wrote, quote, "Before long, nature, which controls it all, will alter everything you see and use it as material for something else, over and over again." End quote. Before we get into the Antonine Plague, which hits Rome in about 165 AD, we need to talk about what historian Kyle Harper calls the disease ecology of the Roman Empire. Basically, what were conditions like in the Roman Empire from a public health standpoint? What were conditions like as far as the prevalence of disease and mortality and death and all of these things. Now, there's a common way of analyzing plagues and cataclysmic events that's called a Malthusian perspective. And while I think this perspective isn't necessarily wrong, it doesn't necessarily get into the nuance of it. So the basic idea of a Malthusian scenario is overpopulation essentially wreaking havoc and creating problems. And while overpopulation can certainly be an issue, and it certainly is an issue when it comes to the spread of these diseases that we're going to be talking about, it's important to also stress that this Antonine Plague and the plagues that we're going to talk about that come after it are the direct consequence of a particular set of circumstances that were happening in the Roman Empire that encompassed more than just overpopulation. This stuff all happened because of the particular evolution of diseases in the wild, mixing with the ecological conditions in the Roman Empire and the realities of human choices. It's important to emphasize that events like the Antonine Plague were not inevitable. It's not like if the population suddenly rises above a certain point, that automatically means that a plague is going to destroy a civilization. Rather, historian Kyle Harper argues it's important to understand that with proper knowledge, better technology, and a resilient approach, disasters like the Antonine Plague could be avoided, theoretically at least. With that out of the way, we can start looking at some of the specific factors that led to the Antonine Plague in 165 AD. Remember from last episode that this is towards the end of the Pax Romana. This is when the Roman Empire is basically at the peak of its powers. But despite the empire being at its peak, there were two main reasons why the Roman Empire was basically ripe for a plague-type event. The first reason that historian Kyle Harper outlines is what he calls the disease ecology of the Roman Empire. What he argues is that the Roman Empire and what it created represented a drastic shift in the way that diseases operated. Harper says, quote, "The Roman Empire built a disease ecology whose ramifications its creators could not have begun to imagine. The empire nurtured urban concentrations whose density had never before been seen and would not be seen for centuries thereafter. The empire facilitated movement and connectivity within its unusually wide and diverse geographical regions. The scale of environmental transformation carried out under Roman rule represented the greatest surge of ecological change between the Neolithic and Industrial revolutions. The commercial networks binding the Romans to peoples beyond the frontier, especially in Africa and Asia, appear stronger than we had ever imagined. And outside of human control, after a period of stability during the Roman climate optimum, a phase of raucous climate disorganization began in the later 2nd century." End quote. There's a lot in there, but one of the things that Kyle Harper is saying is that we do need to be careful not to make sweeping generalizations across the empire. Living in the city of Rome is going to be completely different than living in some rural area in, say, Egypt. But as a whole, the Roman Empire put things into place that the world had never seen before. Cities on a scale that had never been populated to the extent that they were populated, changes to the environment that were man-made that had never been done on such a big scale, connectivity between different regions and different climates of the world that had never been connected to such a large extent. And you start to get the picture of this changing Roman world that's becoming more and more conducive to the spread of disease. Even before you start talking about big picture pandemics that are going to be absolutely devastating to the population of Rome, disease, health, and mortality in the empire was not exactly stellar. There was high rates of infant mortality. About 30% of live births didn't survive the first year. The average life expectancy was between 20 and 30 years. Kyle Harper estimates it's around 27 if you were a female, around 26 if you were a male. I mean, take Marcus Aurelius, who we talked about earlier in the episode. He's at the top of the food chain as one of the most powerful emperors of all time, and he had 12 dead children. Archaeologists and scientists look at written evidence, but they also look at physical evidence from bones that we've managed to uncover from this time period. It's not a perfect tool, but we can estimate that men's average height was roughly around 5'4". Women were less than 5 feet tall for the most part. So in general, Romans during this period appear to be physically less strong, less capable, and less healthy, certainly than people today, but also when compared to Romans during the Republic period. What's interesting about this is, again, this goes against that Malthusian approach where it would probably say overpopulation leads to scarcity of resources, which leads to people not having enough food and starvation, and then we start getting disease and stuff. That doesn't appear to be the case. The evidence doesn't seem to show that Romans during this period were malnourished on a large extent. There doesn't appear to be lots of famines. We know that even common Romans had a diet of bread and seafood at a minimum. So it wasn't necessarily malnutrition or overpopulation directly, but Kyle Harper thinks it might have been just rampant disease everywhere you go and the physiological stress that this puts on the average Roman body. Again, by looking at all of these physiological tools, archaeological tools, Kyle Harper can make inferences about what the health might have been like for Romans. So a lot of this connects with the written sources and corroborates the written sources, but the technology that we have now allows us to look at bones and teeth and spines and skeletons. Harper says, quote, "Where the documentary evidence abandons us, bones are starting to come to the rescue. Skeletons tell stories. Spines and joints can attest to debilitating chronic illnesses or the grinding stress of hard labor. The vaults of skulls and the orbits of the eyes can preserve hard evidence for a condition called parodic hyperostosis, a marker of physiological stress. Chemical analysis of stable isotopes can trace patterns of diet and migration. Teeth are a record of diet, nutrition, and health. They are permanently corroded by the monotony of carbohydrates, and the striations in their enamel can preserve memories of stress during developmental periods. In short, the biological burden borne by the inhabitants of the Roman Empire is still written on their bones." End quote. I think a good analogy to make here might be to something like the Industrial Revolution and the working class during the Industrial Revolution. As society was making incredible advancements, and in general, the standard of living was kind of improving, for the working class, in a lot of cases, that wasn't what was happening. The physiological stress of working in the factories and the disease conditions there, in many cases, stunted the growth of workers and children, and so on and so forth. It's not a perfect analogy, but Kyle Harper thinks something similar might have been going on at the peak of the Roman Empire. If you lived in a city like Rome, death was simply a fact of life. Oftentimes it came not necessarily at a steady drip, as in deaths constantly happening slowly over the course of the year, but rather a totally chaotic and oscillating series of waves. Usually these waves would be the worst in the summer and the fall, and these waves would sweep away those Romans who weren't healthy enough to withstand them. In cities like Rome, there were some good things. For example, the aqueducts brought, for the most part, clean running water to the cities. Much has been made of the public toilets that were a part of the Roman ecosystem. But a deeper analysis also reveals some of the weaknesses of those public toilets. Oftentimes, they weren't connected to sewer lines at all, because especially upper-class families were concerned about the risk of gas from the sewers, the risk of rodents coming up from the sewers into the house, the risk of potential flooding as a result of connection to those sewer lines. So basically what this meant was you had to have sort of a manual system of waste disposal. And at any time, a city could be living in 100,000 pounds of crap a day. This would be great if your job was to fertilize crops, but it would also be great if you were a tapeworm or a roundworm or some sort of infectious biological agent. As a result, bacterial infections, typhoid fever, dysentery, diarrhea, all of these diseases were common, spread by insects and contamination and contact and contaminated food, and these diseases were deadly. Malaria as well. In many places, the Roman Empire really set up the perfect conditions for mosquito breeding by cutting down forests and eliminating trees and plant substances that can absorb water runoff. Oftentimes this would create floods, which would create marshes and bogs and basically mosquito-y kingdoms. Some people have argued that hundreds of years later, and we'll get there, Attila the Hun, instead of hanging out in Italy, decided just to pack up his stuff and leave because he was done dealing with the disease that he was running into in Italy. Tuberculosis and leprosy were common, transmitted by human contact and breath. And I probably don't have to tell you that the treatment for a lot of these diseases was not exactly impeccable. We talked about the Greek orator Aristides last episode, and here's him talking about how he was treated by a Roman doctor. Quote, "The doctors made an incision, beginning from my chest all the way down to the bladder, and when the cupping instruments were applied, my breathing was completely stopped, and a pain, numbing and impossible to bear, passed through me, and everything was smeared with blood, and I was violently purged." End quote. Bloodletting and purging and the use of medical instruments that remind you of that torture scene in The Princess Bride were common. Overall, Kyle Harper refers to these diseases and their treatments as the common diseases that you would expect to see from place to place as you traveled through the Roman Empire. And these common diseases were terrible and deadly and not well understood, but they weren't pandemics. They had their own limits, and for the most part, these were not illnesses or diseases that were going to bring down the Roman Empire. Harper says, quote, "The patterns of death in the empire were shaped by the needs, methods, and constraints of specific microbial organisms. These microbes had their own weapons and their own limits. Malaria was acute and lethal, but bound by the geography and life cycle of its mosquito vector. Shigellosis thrived in the dense, dirty cities, but relied on the local pathways of the fecal-oral route. Tuberculosis and leprosy, transmitted directly between humans, loved the endless vistas opened by Roman transportation networks, but they were slow migrants. The limits of these pathogens, and others less visible in the record, were biologically self-imposed, not inherent in the disease ecology of the Roman Empire. For the right pathogen, the conditions of the empire might offer unfathomable opportunities." End quote. What he's saying there, I think, is that these diseases we outlined, like tuberculosis and malaria and leprosy, so on and so forth, have limits. And they weren't necessarily perfectly constructed to spread inside of the Roman Empire because of those limits. But what was coming with the Antonine Plague and some of the plagues that come after this period that we'll get to in future episodes was not going to be constrained. There were no self-imposed biological limits that didn't fit inside the Roman Empire. Think of it like a puzzle piece where you have the disease and the way it spreads and the amount of death and the death rate and all of those factors. And then you have the other puzzle piece, which is the specific conditions inside the Roman Empire. And when that becomes a perfect fit, the fit of disease and empire, that's when you get pandemics and plagues and death on a astronomical scale. Earlier, we mentioned 2 reasons why the Roman Empire was ripe for a pandemic to strike. We just went over the disease ecology of the empire, the specific ways that disease was common already and weakened the population from that perspective. But the other reason is simply the global connectivity and the network of trade and interaction that the Roman Empire fostered between different regions of the world. This was not just Mediterranean trade. This was global trade that had never been seen before at this scale. Kyle Harper and others have looked at what recent scientists, archaeologists, and people who uncover ancient artifacts, and what they've found is that Roman materials and currency and artifacts are not just found in the Mediterranean area, but increasingly we're finding them in India, we're finding them in East Asia. But in particular, the Indian Ocean trade is now just beginning to be understood as a hub of Roman trade. We've found document evidence, we've found merchant contracts, we've even found cookbooks with ingredient lists that include stuff that you would only find in India. Trade in luxury goods, silk, spices, ivory, slaves, and of course, germs. We don't have a ton of evidence of direct contact between China and Rome, but it did happen, at least on a diplomatic level. East Africa was piped into this trade. So you have 3+ continents engaging in trade and interaction that really hadn't done so on a large scale before. So this means that new germs, new diseases can be introduced to places that have never seen them before and aren't prepared for them, biologically and environmentally. But that's only part of the problem. Yes, when this trade is happening, it's spreading germs and diseases to new places, which is terrible, and which is sort of the basic understanding of how this works with germs and trade. But Kyle Harper argues that this global connectivity not only allows for old germs to be spread to new places, but it allows for new germs that have recently mutated and become their own thing to now suddenly have an opportunity to spread like wildfire across the globe, which can be incredibly dangerous. Kyle Harper says, quote, "Where goods and gods go, so do germs. The real biological significance of the Indian Ocean system was not that it fused the civilized diseased pools of Eurasia, but rather that it formed a superconductor for emerging infectious diseases. The tropics are an evolutionary hothouse of disease. Central Africa is home to some of the richest vertebrate and microbial biodiversity on the planet. Consequentially, it has been and remains a dangerously productive zone of evolutionary experiment, the cradle of a disproportionate number of the pathogens capable of causing humans harm. The drama of disease history lies in the incessant collision of pathogen evolution and human connectivity. In the Roman Empire, those two forces came together in a particularly consequential way." End quote. With the combination of the disease ecology of the Roman Empire and the global connectivity that the Roman Empire was fostering, the Antonine Plague was ripe to strike in 165 and ravage the Roman Empire until roughly 180. The Antonine Plague was probably born out of some version of the smallpox virus. The genetic evidence seems to show that it probably started in Africa, jumping from gerbils to camels to humans, where it spread to Egypt and the Nile, Red Sea, Indian Ocean trading areas, and then traveling along the Roman roads and the Roman trade networks into the Roman Empire, spreading from southeast to northwest. Historian Kyle Harper discusses what happens once someone gets infected with this virus. Quote, "The virus was contracted by the inhalation of airborne droplets, expelled by an infectious person. Once smallpox virions invaded a new victim, the virus was exceptionally pathogenic. Most infected people became sick at some level. The virus first multiplied into the mucosa, then in the lymph nodes and spleen with bewildering speed. Smallpox overran the initial immune response, and the body began scrambling to resist. This incubation phase could be relatively prolonged, 7 to 19 days, but usually around 12. During this false lull, the patient was not contagious, but neither was the victim yet immobilized, meaning the virus could travel far and fast. The first symptoms were fever and malaise. The victim was soon infectious. There was some vomiting and diarrhea and back pain. In the most common course of the disease, the fever receded within a few days, just as the first harbingers of the skin pathology appeared. Painful lesions formed in the throat or mouth. A macular rash appeared on the face and the entire body, more densely over the face and extremities than the trunk. When the rash launched, it had an eventful 2 weeks or so, as the pox protruded from the skin and became vesicular. Then the bumps turned pustular, until after 5 days or so, they began to scab. The patient was most infectious during the fever and onset of the rash, but remained contagious until the scabs fell off. When the scabs fell, they left behind disfiguring scars. The whole course of infection was about 32 days." End quote. That's all assuming you make it 32 days and survive that long. But the way smallpox impacted different areas of the Roman Empire depended on the different conditions in different towns and cities and areas of the empire. So it was different in different areas. But by and large, you were not contagious for the first 12 days. That meant you couldn't spread the disease when you didn't have symptoms, so there was no asymptomatic spread of the disease. But what you could do is take the disease with you to a new place. In the last episode, we talked about how the scale and scope of the Roman trade and economic system meant that one day you could be in Egypt, and 3 or 4 days later, you could be in a totally different area of the empire. You could go from Rome to North Africa in a couple days. You could go from Egypt to Rome in a week or so. So although you aren't spreading the disease asymptomatically, what you could be doing is bringing the disease to a new area, and then once you become contagious, you start spreading it there. There does seem to be some awareness of the contagiousness of the disease as far as doctors and nurses at the time, but there doesn't seem to be enough built into the political and medical systems to really have a sophisticated understanding of how contagiousness works and affects the spread of disease. Kyle Harper identifies 3 important characteristics of a pandemic, which is basically just a disease that spreads far and wide. The first element he calls the total contact rate. The contact rate of a disease is the likelihood that you're going to come into contact with another person. So for this Antonine Plague, the contact rate was pretty high. This is where we get back to that Roman connectivity and trade and global economy. So there were transportation networks and there was trade going on between different areas. The population in cities was dense, so it was very likely you would come into contact with other people. Like we said before, there wasn't a sophisticated understanding of germ theory, so social distancing would not have been a thing. The contact rate was high. The next element that Kyle Harper talks about is the transmission risk, which means how likely are you to spread it if you actually come into contact with someone. For this particular disease, the transmission risk was high, but it was not as high as something like the flu. But what really made it deadly was the case fatality rate. And the fatality rate was around 30 to 40%. Like most pandemics, it hit the old and the younger populations particularly hard. Another factor was that small towns and villages could become ticking time bombs that could wipe out everybody. You could have someone with the virus pass through your town, spread the virus to somebody, and you wouldn't even know for 2 weeks until someone started showing symptoms that an entire town was affected. Take that 30 to 40% fatality rate, add on some of the unhealthy conditions that might have already been going on in the town at the time, mix in a little bit of a particularly bad disease ecology in that particular place, and entire towns were totally decimated. Mass graves and plague pits have been uncovered. These things happened. There's some evidence to suggest that it struck military life particularly hard, soldiers living in barracks. You can imagine at this time not being the perfect scenario to prevent the spread of smallpox. People throughout the Roman Empire responded to the plague probably as you would expect them to respond. A mix of desperation and fear, emotion, anger, and dread. But there was also a religious response. Kyle Harper says, quote, "Plagues always stirred feelings of helpless, primitive dread, and the Antonine Plague touched deep chords of religious fear. From the mists of time, the god Apollo had been associated with pestilence. In Homer's epic poetry, he was the archer who sent arrows of plague. In the course of the outbreak, the rumor spread that a pestilential vapor had seeped from the temple of the long-haired Apollo in Seleucia. Some of the most remarkable testimony to the scale of the pestilence is to be found in the remains of the desperate, empire-wide attempt to placate the god whose anger was blamed for the catastrophe." End quote. Across the empire, statues to Apollo were erected, inscriptions were put on gravestones, sacrifices and libations were made, and there seems to be real evidence of a religious response to this plague that was ravaging the empire. It's no surprise that people were searching for comfort and hope, because Kyle Harper estimates that between 7 and 8 million people were dead as a result of the Antonine Plague. So there you have it. Humanity getting a nice, warm welcome to the world of global pandemics. And again, like all pandemics, it wasn't just the horrific casualties and the fear and the existential dread that people were feeling. It was the secondary and tertiary effects of the pandemic on Roman systems. There were economic troubles as a result of the plague. Silver mining almost completely collapsed. This led to currency debasement. The price of goods, the price of food goes up. There's inflation. The value of wheat going down means the value of land is going down. Imagine the value of your home going down while the price of everything else is going up. Not good. Kyle Harper estimates a 15 to 20% death rate in the military, meaning that they now had a recruitment crisis and a future difficulty when it came to recruiting. Roman wars would begin becoming less successful than quote-unquote normal, and there was a seeming shift from exponential conquest and growth to maintenance, maintaining the empire that Rome had, and more of a defense mode, preservation rather than conquest. The response to the plague may have created a decentralizing effect where local elites were encouraged to govern more, and as a result, when the crisis ends, they yearn for more power, creating a more fractious system. But on the whole, the Roman Empire weathered the storm that was the Antonine Plague. Remember that this was the Roman Empire at the peak of its powers, and it was demonstrating the resilience that it had. Kyle Harper defines resilience as the measure of a society's capacity to absorb big shocks to the system and to recover from injury. So the Romans had this resilience. They had these ways to mitigate risk. First of all, most areas kept food storage for crisis situations. Food shortage typically didn't become an issue, especially in cities that were located close to trade routes and waterways, because they could import and bring in food when necessary. The Roman government had systems of response that varied in degree from inept to incredibly capable. But the point is, they had a variety of tools at their disposal, whether it be price fixing or erecting public works, food and water distribution, changing the way that currency or tax systems operated, and maybe more importantly, a sense of legitimacy. Central to that Roman ethos we talked about earlier in the episode is the idea of patronage and reciprocity. The Roman emperor was seen as the highest patron, responsible for all of the lands under his command. Wealthy locals in times of crisis often viewed themselves in a similar fashion, looking to help, looking to put things right when possible. The Romans also had political resilience built into their system. An imperial succession system worked well when it worked, granting legitimacy and stability. Look at a ruler like Marcus Aurelius, or look at rulers like Diocletian or Constantine, generally seen as some of the better Roman emperors, and you see stability and legitimacy built into their rule. The Romans also had a vast imperial bureaucracy with administrators who felt like they were part of what was known as a grand bargain. Again, working with a sense of legitimacy from the emperor, with the tentacles spreading out to different regions in the Roman Empire. Locals felt like they could be a part of the Roman system. There were avenues to succeed, to move up in the Roman ladder, and as a result, there was a reciprocal relationship. We talked about ways that the Roman government could change the taxation system, and we'll get into that more in future plagues. And then another area of resilience is just simply the dominance of the Roman military, their ability to not just win battles, but provide local surveillance, civil engineering, building networks that could help Roman people, whether it be roads or trade networks or forts and travel stations. So this system of Roman resilience could absorb shocks, and it could withstand it. But the problem was that each shock that the Roman Empire would absorb would expose a crack or two. And then the empire would have to reorganize and rebuild in a way to account for that weakness. So as far as the Antonine Plague goes, 7 to 8 million people die. Economic troubles and military troubles and political troubles do hit the empire, but Marcus Aurelius is able to keep it together, admirably even. The shock of the Antonine Plague was endured, And as Kyle Harper puts it, the internal logic of the Roman Empire endured. This is the resilience coming through. But the shocks were going to continue to come, both from human choices and political events, but also from climate and disease events. And the Roman Empire would not hold up as well to those future cracks and those future shocks. And it seems like the wise Marcus Aurelius probably knew this. The fall must always come after the rise, and acceptance of this is one way to deal with it. A key hallmark of Marcus Aurelius's Stoic philosophy is that the end is coming for us all. He says in his meditations, quote, "Don't let yourself forget how many doctors have died after furrowing their brows over how many deathbeds, how many astrologers after pompous forecasts about others' ends, how many philosophers after endless disquisitions on death and immortality, how many warriors after inflicting thousands of casualties themselves, how many tyrants after abusing the power of life and death atrociously as if they were themselves immortal. How many whole cities have met their end, and all the ones you know yourself, one after another, one who laid out another for burial and was buried himself, and then the man who buried him, all in the same short space of time." End quote. Strangely enough, in the very next passage, Marcus Aurelius advocates for the way to live knowing that the end is coming. He says that you should be, quote, "like the rock that the waves keep crashing over. It stands unmoved, and the raging of the sea falls still around it." End quote. For hundreds of years, the Roman Empire must have felt like this rock, indestructible, unmovable, perpetual. But a storm of climate and disease was coming, and the resilience of the Roman Empire would ultimately break.